So hello, everyone. My name is Sam Biggers. I work with Dominion Traditional Building Group. We are a historic masonry contractor and consultant who has had the pleasure to work on Berry Hill. You guys are going to learn all about it today, and I'll let Casey introduce herself and run through what we're going to talk about.
Sure. Well, can everybody hear me okay? All right, good to go. All right, well, I'm Casey Squires. I am a historic preservationist. For my full-time job, I am currently the town planner or the historic preservation planner for the town of Warrenton. So just kind of briefly, I started on this Berry Hill project about 3 years ago now. So it's been a long labor of love, and I'm certainly grateful at this point to have had the help and the guidance and the hard work of Sam and his team at Dominion Traditional. Those folks have put in a lot of hours to help myself and to help the community with documenting this house and getting it to a point where it's stable, where it's at a good point where it can be preserved, and to a point where we can continue to move forward from this point. So I don't know if Sam, if you wanted to kind of do the run through,
Sure.
How you wanted to do that.
Yeah, so Casey will run through the project beginnings, kind of how everything started. It's a pretty interesting story. She's also going to run through the history of the house, both the people and the house itself. And then I'm going to go through our documentation effort and the demolition and what we found. And then Casey's going to wrap it up with plans for the property moving forward. And with that, I'll let Casey start off.
All right, so let's get started with these project beginnings. So just as kind of a little bit of a personal background here. So I came into working with Berry Hill as a very personal project. I have worked in the field of historic preservation professionally for about 8 years now in a myriad of capacities. I've worked with historic trades. I've worked in archaeology. I specialize in historic preservation and conservation easements. So I've worked with a lot of houses, specifically throughout the state of Virginia. And so I've seen a lot of good examples of preservation. I've seen a lot of horrible examples of preservation. I've seen successes, I've seen failures, and everything in between. But with the amount of historic resources throughout the state of Virginia, throughout the Mid-Atlantic, there's always that one house, I think, for every preservationist that just somehow manages to stick with you on a deeply emotional level. And you have no explanation for it, but you feel the need to do something about it. So enter Berry Hill. So I ended up finding out about the house in a roundabout way, and it's because of this guy right here on the screen. This is VMI Cadet Private Jacqueline Beverly Stannard. So I was actually doing some personal Civil War related research on the Battle of Newmarket that occurred in Newmarket, Virginia. Cadet Stannard was mortally wounded at the Battle of Newmarket that took place on May 15th, 1864. So the archive at Virginia Military Institute actually has a very good collection remaining of Cadet Stannard's personal letters. So within those letters, as you'll see here at the bottom of the screen, I took just a little excerpt from one of his letters. In several of them, he mentions his homesickness for a place called Berry Hill. He was from Orange, Virginia, or Orange Courthouse, as they called it then. Stannard was born in 1845 to a prominent family here in Orange, Virginia. His father was Robert Beverly Stannard. His mother was Ellen Bankhead Tolliver Stannard, another prominent name here, the Tolliver family. So I just kind of started to think, after so many years of reading through these letters and researching the Stannard family in particular, I wanted to understand more about Berry Hill. I wanted to understand more about this place that he called home and that he was homesick for. So in this particular letter, he is asking his mother a question. This is a letter he wrote on April 14th, 1863. Is there a prospect of much fruit at Berry Hill this season? Won't I miss sister's cherries? So there are lots of nice little anecdotal things that really kind of give a little insight into what life was like at Berry Hill in the 1860s in particular. So because of that, fast forward about 3 years ago, I kind of started to do a little local research, as I call it, which means I started to kind of belly up to bars in town, and I started to get to know the locals of Orange. I kind of started to talk. I wanted to know more. I wanted to find someone who knew more about Berry Hill, which was just this mysterious house that sat up on a hill overlooking the town of Orange. I ended up finding a wonderful group of people here, and I'm sure some of them are here tonight. And so I completely appreciate their help from the very beginning. You know who you are. So I kind of had a cadre of folks here that helped me kind of get the first access point to the Berry Hill property, and who introduced me to the now late owner of Berry Hill, which was the Honorable Helen Marie Taylor, who passed away a couple of years ago. But fortunately, I guess fate was in my favor at that point in time. I ended up writing a handwritten letter to Mrs. Taylor. So I wrote that to her. I mailed that to her home in Richmond, Virginia. And lo and behold, only a few days later, I was contacted by Mrs. Taylor, who wanted to speak with me. She invited me to her home in Richmond. I ended up sitting down at her bedside and having a discussion about the future of Berry Hill, the goals that she had set for the house. This was a house that she was also, very much had an affinity for. And through the Stannard family in particular, she also had a Taylor family connection to Berry Hill. So this is something she wanted to see undertaken. And I know that she wanted it to be undertaken by the right people who had the right mindset and wanted to do right by the house. So fortunately, that evening, she did give me permission to assist in the ongoing preservation efforts for Berry Hill. I was hired on as a private preservation consultant to do some background research on the property, to kind of get the ball rolling, do some on-site visits, to assess the property, to figure out where we were at as far as the preservation efforts were going to be concerned, and just kind of try to figure out what those next steps are going to look like for this house. So after I started kind of doing that background research, I did several solo site visits. I did several site visits with a few other preservationists that are here in Virginia to get just kind of a head start on understanding where we needed to go. One of those things that I ended up doing was reaching out to the folks at Dominion Traditional Building Group. This is obviously a house that is a masonry house of masonry construction, a brick house. So I wanted someone who had that historic trades specialized skill to be able to deal with a property like this. It was also very apparent on all of my initial site visits that the state of the house was in a fairly rapid disrepair. The house had sat vacant, unfortunately, for a number of years. There were already noticeably several fracturing, several settling movements. There was episodes of collapsing that were occurring at the house already by the time I came along. So I definitely wanted someone to come out there that had that specific background to deal with this specific year of house, that specific material. So that is where I ended up having a site visit. I reached out to Dominion Traditional. Sam came out along with Mike Ondricht, who was the project manager for this at the time. And so they were able to come out. So this was actually from one of those initial site visits. You can see Sam and Mike there pondering. So I mentioned that there were some stages of collapse that were already occurring with the house. This is on what was the wing of the house. And so as you can see there, you can kind of see even up at the top where that door is situated, there were some major fractures that were beginning to occur. Let me see if I can do that the right way. Yes, there we go. So you can see, it's shaky, but you can see some of the fracturing occurring, obviously the major collapse that was starting to occur. And that is just on one elevation. On pretty much every single elevation of this wing, which included, you can't really see it in this photo, but right there next to where Mike is standing in the burgundy, there is also a circa 1907 kitchen addition that was attached to this wing of the house. So both of those structures, because they had sat vacant for so long, and then additionally due to some other issues that really date back to the original construction of the wing in the first place. And that's something that Sam will be able to get into a little bit later to kind of show you those nuanced details of ultimately why the wing ended up failing. But basically due to the fact that this wing and the kitchen addition sat vacant, and due to those underlying structural issues that were there from the very beginning, a lot of this was, as we started to realize early in the game, was not going to be salvageable, that there was no way that we were going to be able to keep this upright or preserve it as is. It was going to collapse anyways, no matter what we did. And so, as you can also see in that picture there, that's from inside the wing up on the second floor. You can see that that wall is starting to pull away from the wing itself. And you could just see daylight, which was obviously at that point letting all of the elements in. There was a lot of rot, a lot of molding, a lot of bricks falling. So, and just some more detailed shots. You can have a better view here. Let me see if I can get that. There we go. All right, so you can see better here. So this is that elevation of the wing. So it's right here, that picture on the previous slide. This is where this wall is starting to pull outward down the hill. So that's where that was happening. And this right here is that 1907 circa kitchen addition that was also starting to come apart as a result of being attached to this wing. And so I'll touch on this a little bit, but again, like I said, I'll let Sam kind of get into more of the detail of this. So I had mentioned the wing itself. Once they started to get in and really do the heavy duty documentative work, once they started to get in and do the salvaging, they really started to see all of these little clues. And that's always just the most exciting part of doing any of these types of projects, even if you're doing it for a reason that you don't necessarily wish you were doing, such as demolition of a structure. But when they started to get in there, they started to notice several clues that I know Sam will bring up later that started to indicate that possibly the wing could have been the original house. So this was an exciting find, but we wanted to make sure, this was just speculative at this point. So we wanted to kind of get into more things, let them do some more documentative work to figure that out. But because of that, we also started to look a little bit more about why did it fail? Why would a house have been built to fail in the beginning? So some of those clues that we started to notice were things like shortcuts taken in the bricklaying process, and almost probably more importantly as well, that led to the demise, is that house would have been built on a sloping grade. So it's difficult to see in that photo, but that's basically going downhill. It's not a steep hill, but it's enough of a sloping grade, and the house is situated right there on the end of it. So essentially what we were able to kind of discover is ever since it was originally built in the early 1800s, it's been doing this. It's just always been doing this. You cannot see them in this picture, but another clue that we were able to look up is we could basically see from things like buttressing on the house that when people came along at a later date and time, the property owner, Reynolds Chapman, was looking for fixes, which just indicated to us that he was well aware that his house was settling, it was moving, it was failing, and he was looking for other craftsmen to do things that were going to hopefully help keep it stabilized. All right, so more formulating a plan here. As I mentioned, by the time I came along, as far as I know, the house had sat vacant for a number of years. I'm unsure how long it sat vacant. It had sat vacant long enough that a lot of that movement continued to happen. There were a lot of those massive issues with the fracturing within the brickwork. Therefore, that was leading to a lot of other issues. Moisture damage in particular was a big issue. There was a lot of freeze-thaw cycle that continued to happen throughout the seasons that was eating away at the mortar joints, leading to even more of these increasing fractures within the walls. Leading to a lot of massive structural issues. So with that being said, after doing some of those initial site visits with Sam, with Mike and his team, we made the ultimate decision that the wing and therefore the 1907 kitchen addition would have to come down. It would need to be demolished. The fortunate side of this is a lot of original material, even from its original construction date, for both the kitchen and for the wing, was salvageable, interior and exterior. And so that was the largest part of formulating our plan, is that we were going to, or more Sam and his team, were going to do the full documentation of the wing, detailed architectural drawings of the wing and the kitchen addition. So that way we have that information for the future moving forward, and then also doing the actual architectural salvage itself before the demolition took place. All right, so I'm going to touch a little bit more. We're going to kind of go backwards just a little bit. I'm going to just touch a little bit on what we know so far about the history of Berry Hill, about the house itself, and also about the people that we're aware of at this point in time. So originally, the property that would become known as Berry Hill Plantation was built on a parcel of about 600 to 700 acres for Reynolds Chapman. So that name might sound familiar to some of you Orange locals. Reynolds Chapman was clerk of the court for Orange Courthouse. It was a position that he held his entire life. Reynolds Chapman was born in 1778. I believe he was sworn in as clerk of the court around 1800, 1801. And that is a position that he would die in when he passed away in 1844. What we've been able to find through deed research, through mutual assurance policies as well, is that this, as I said, Berry Hill, the way it started out was about 3 separate parcels. So Reynolds Chapman essentially ended up purchasing all 3 of those parcels between a certain period of time, roughly between 1803 to 1806, maybe 1807, to encompass the entire property of about 700 or so acres of what would become Berry Hill. After Chapman's death in 1844, a number of his relatives would actually end up holding the deed to Berry Hill. One of those in particular was a nephew of his named William Henry Chapman. And this is where my roundabout standard family research comes into play. So William Henry Chapman, Reynolds' nephew, would end up marrying Mary Ellen Stannard. So Mary Ellen Stannard was the eldest daughter of Robert Beverly Stannard and Ellen Bankhead Tolliver Stannard. So Mary Ellen would have been Cadet Stannard's oldest sister. So because of that relationship, throughout the years, in about the late 1850s into the mid-1860s, a good number of the Stannard family and the Chapman family resided at Berry Hill. There was also, at a certain point, and I guess William Henry Chapman and several of his Chapman relatives ended up having to give up Berry Hill. Berry Hill was owned by the Stannard family siblings for a number of years. The Stannard family siblings ended up selling Berry Hill in 1872 to Mr. Joseph H. Johnson. It's at that point in 1872 that Berry Hill is out of Chapman and Stannard family ownership forever at that point. So, and then fast forward a little bit more, there were a couple of other owners after Mr. Johnson that came along in the late 19th century. And then for most of the 20th century, Berry Hill was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Roland Flint Hill Jr. So they operated a dairy farm for several decades there at the Berry Hill property. And if you've ever seen photos or if you've ever been up to the property, you can still see today there are still several fantastic examples there from the Hill family dairy farm, like these Sears and Roebuck kit barns. And those barns might look familiar to you because these are the same types of Sears and Roebuck kit barns that you'll find at Montpelier. So they're wonderful architectural additions to the Berry Hill property. So eventually, after Mr. and Mrs. Hill passed away, the children continued to operate the farm for a while. At that point, that is when the property was put up for auction in the late 1980s or 1990s. That is when the late Mrs. Helen Marie Taylor bought the property at auction. Since her passing, the house has now been owned and put under the Helen Marie Taylor Irrevocable Trust. All right, so I mentioned a little bit ago those mutual assurance or insurance policies. You might not be familiar with them. Some of you might be. If you are not familiar with the mutual assurance policies, well, they're still around today. It's essentially one of the oldest fire insurance policies that you can find. I believe they began around 1801, 1803, somewhere around in there. I don't know if you know, Sam.
I think it was earlier.
It might have been earlier.
Yeah,
than that.
1760s.
Well,
70s.
right. It had to be earlier than that. So it's very old. They've been around for a long time. This was a very recent addition that we added to this presentation. This was actually some research that Sam was able to discover in these mutual assurance policies. So we were able to find 2 of them, one from 1799, one from 1805. So basically what this is telling us is this is from a parcel that would become what was known as Berry Hill. So you can see on this one right over here. So this is the earlier one from 1799. So this is when this parcel was owned by a man named Thomas Bell. On the assurance policy itself, it has some really good information to glean from it. It has the property name, it has how much it was insured for, it has the property owner, and then it typically will always include even a rudimentary drawing showing you any improvements that are already there on that parcel. So in this case, we were excited to find that even in 1799, there was a dwelling house of some form or fashion already on that parcel. So let me see if you can kind of bring it up here. So this one from 1799 is a wooden dwelling house, 40 by 10, 1 story high, with a wing of wood, 26 by 14, 1 story high. And then we move to 1805. It is now a drawing of the exact same parcel. It is now owned by Reynolds Chapman. It is still at this point called Evergreen Plantation. And at this point, what it has changed a little bit to a wooden dwelling house, 1 story high by 14 feet wide, underpinned with brick 1.5 foot above the surface of the ground. Another more speculative thing that Sam and I will now have to continue to try to figure out if there is an association is from a 1957 HABS report, so a structural report that was completed in the 1950s. There are 4 photos. One of those photos shows this little 1-story frame structure with a brick foundation. So that's just kind of more fuel to the fire that we're going to have to continue to research and piece out to kind of figure out if potentially maybe that was one of the original 1805 dwelling houses that was situated on the property. And once Reynolds Chapman came into ownership, he let that remain, used as an outbuilding of some sort. We don't know what it would have been used for right now, and had his original house built, which he then would change the name to Berry Hill. And that's where we've come into this. So I just wanted to include a little snapshot just to show you the change in name from Evergreen Plantation. This is a deed from April 4th, 1846. This is between Rebecca Conway Madison Chapman, who is now the widow of Reynolds Chapman. This is basically just to show you there in particular where I've highlighted it. This is one of the first evidences in a deed where we were seeing it, the property commonly called Berry Hill. And here is that 1957 HABS report. These are the photos that were included. You can see the 2 elevation shots of the house as it stood at that point. The building right here is a 19th century smokehouse that still stands today. It's the only 19th century outbuilding that still stands on the property. And this is what Sam and his team were able to find. This is the builder's board, which we actually have on display in the back there. And I will say, just as a side note, we have some artifacts on the back if you feel free to take a look at them. So we do have that builder's board that they were able to find in a floorboard. This was the initial clue that made everybody start to think that maybe the wing was the original house. So it does have a July 1806 date on it. So we have yet to make out the names. We were thinking maybe they were the original builders of that house. After further inspection, it does seem that maybe one of the names is a female name. So we're not sure if they were visitors. We're not sure who they were. But it does, in fact, have Orange County, Virginia written on it. It does have an 1806 date on it. And then, like I said, Sam will touch on that. But there were several other clues in the salvage and documentation process that also really started to make us think that that was going to be the original house that he then added on to further. All right.
I'll take over. All right, so Casey has brought us up to pretty much current day. And like she mentioned, we came into this thinking that Berry Hill, the main part of the house that is very Jeffersonian that I'll get into, was the original house, and that the wing that was falling down was a wing, a later wing. So we kind of went into it with that assumption. But the more we looked into it, the more we realized that that was a false assumption, which was pretty exciting because it's kind of opposite of how you think a house would evolve. So I'm going to run through what we found based on all of our architectural investigation and some of the visuals that kind of back up our theories here. So this is part of our documentation. On the right, we drew a floor plan and built an axon so you can kind of understand how the house developed over time. And it's based on the evidence. We think it's pretty clear that the front of the house had a front door that was kind of asymmetrical. And you can tell that if you look really closely under here, the whole facade is Flemish bond brick. And Flemish bond has a stretcher, which is the long side of the brick, and then a header. And if you look underneath this window, the Flemish bond is flawless. Typically, when you're building a house out of Flemish bond, it's a high style house. There's a high level of detail, attention paid to detail. But if you look under this window, it kind of gets wonky. And on top of that, we have these beautiful sandstone window wells, and there wasn't one under there. So that was our first clue that maybe there was a change that happened. And our second clue on the inside, so this window right here is the back side of this window. You can see right underneath, I don't know how well it shows up for everyone in the audience, but there's a soldier course where the bricks are turned vertical, which masons do if they get their coursing off. It's kind of like we made a mistake, let's just turn the brick, let's plaster over it and walk away. So that's another indication that there was a change and they were trying to make it right before they plastered over. Probably the craziest thing we figured out was that it appears that the floors were raised at one point, which we're still kind of scratching our head, but the evidence speaks for this. In the west room, you can kind of see where we have that dashed line. There was an indentation in the brick, and this is right below the hearth for the second floor above. That didn't make sense to us. On top of that, if you looked in between the joists above, and I think you can see one right there too, you have nailers that were in between the floor joists. And so we started looking at that and saying, that doesn't make any sense. Why functionally would you put a wood nailer where it's never going to be seen? And what we realized was that the floors were originally lower, and that this indentation right here was for the hearth cradle. So it would have been wooden boards that would have sat on that ledge. Sand would have been filled in there, and then the hearth for the floor above, for the fireplace above, would have sat on that. Likewise, the nailer up here was originally for the baseboard above, for the floor above. So that floor sat, I think, about 9 inches lower to about a foot lower. And these nailers that currently serve no purpose were actually used for baseboard. So it seems like a lot of work to go through to raise your floors, but apparently they did. And then we also were able to kind of solve some mysteries here in the basement. And this may be a lot to decipher. I try to do my best, but you can see these two double joists right here that are running, and these run east-west. So this way in plan. And we started noticing they have these preservationists call them ghost mortises. So it's a hole in the wood that a tenon would have gone into at one point, but they were just hanging out in space. Didn't make any sense. And what we realized was that when the floors were raised, originally before the floors were raised, these acted like a summer beam. So they would have run the width of the room, and you would have had joists that would have gone into them, kind of like a summer beam. And when they raised the floors, they took all those joists somehow and turned them all the same direction, which is what a lot of houses you typically see. So that was another mystery solved. So phase one, it's a pretty standard 2-story brick house with an asymmetrical entrance. And then phase 2 is what Berry Hill is really known for. There's a pretty good amount of documentation that shows that William B. Phillips actually built the main part of Berry Hill that's so famous. William B. Phillips was probably most famously known for building much of the original part of UVA. He and Jefferson were best pals. And these are two other buildings he's built: Madison County Courthouse and Page County Courthouse. If you search William B. Phillips, you'll find plenty of documentation about all the houses and all the buildings he's built. But he was known to be a master brick mason. Jefferson liked him because he was the finest brick mason in the state at the time. And that really shows the fact that Reynolds Chapman used him, shows that he was really, Chapman wanted a good house built. And what we determined here was that originally Berry Hill had an open portico with columns similar to what you see at the pavilions at UVA. And actually if you look at, I think it's Pavilion 9, it's pretty striking, the similarities between the two houses, or between the two buildings. So really, apart from the addition, not much changes here. But we'll get into kind of what we figure out, and it's still somewhat of somewhat of conjecture. But at this point, when he builds the main part of Berry Hill, we believe that's when he raises the floors to line up with the floors in the main part of the house. We also believe that he takes this brick portion of the original house and reclads it in brick that matches the brick that's used for the new addition. So you can tell it was quite a bit of work that went into making this one quote unquote coherent house. So here's some evidence. This is all full of mysteries that we one by one solved. One of these mysteries was, why is the brick a different color on the upper part of the addition as the lower part? And we figured out that it was because that was a later addition. They used different bricks. So that's one thing. And then this is kind of an interesting thing. Around the side, we believe this happened at the same time that the pavilion was bricked in. You can kind of pick it up, but I outlined it. We believe there were also pretty huge second-story windows and then fanlight first-story windows that were also bricked in at the same time. When, we're not quite sure. We know it was after 1827. It was likely probably in the 1840s or 50s when they needed more space for bedrooms, which is why they bricked in that pavilion. So then phase 4 is the addition of the kitchen in 1907, which architecturally didn't really pose many mysteries to us. It was pretty straightforward. But this was pretty interesting because it was built on a concrete foundation, and concrete by 1907 was pretty much still in its infancy in America. So that kind of pointed towards some kind of experimental building at the time, which was interesting. But the kitchen had living space above, a pantry. It was a pretty standard addition. So like Casey said, we came in after we did our initial assessment. We priced up a number of different options, one of which was to take it down brick by brick and rebuild it, which was just not really an option. So being a preservationist, we're trying to be wary of just tearing down the building and walking away. A building that's falling down really presents an opportunity to learn more, such as finding that builder's board. So we wanted to really do our part and give it the documentation that it deserves. So we spent about 4 weeks on site pulling tape and taking photos and doing drawings. And I have a few photos of some of this. Mike, who works for us, was an architectural draftsman for 30 years, so that helps. He decided he didn't want to be a draftsman because he was sitting down too much, so now he's a mason. So he was a huge asset and was able to do some really beautiful hand drawings that we put in our set. And we did extensive photographic documentation. We did AutoCAD drawings. This is all to HABS standards, if anyone's familiar with HABS. And so this was a really neat opportunity to make a deliverable that could be used in the future. We also use photogrammetry. I don't know if many are familiar with that, but essentially you take a bunch of photos, plug it into a program, and it makes a 3D model of the house. So we're able to kind of do multiple things and come at it from multiple different angles so that this is preserved in some way for the future. Then we started the salvaging process. The house was tricky because there were parts of it that just weren't safe to really go into. And when you think about a house, you think about especially a brick house, a lot of the rigidity comes from the joists being tied into the brick and the floorboards being attached to the joists and everything working as a system. So there were some things that we just couldn't take out without the house falling down around us. But we were able to get up all the flooring, all the mantelpieces, all the doors, a lot of the trim. And where we weren't able to get all of it, we were able to get a representative portion so that if in the future we needed to get a trim profile for a future construction project, we could get that. And there were some pretty, it was an interesting process watching a house come down around you. Oh, excuse me. We also salvaged a vast majority of the brick on site. So you can see just the house with its guts open, which was, Casey especially felt this. It was sad. We all love historic houses, and for some of us it was gut-wrenching, but it was also so fascinating to see how a house was built and how a house was put together, and also how a house has failed over 200 years. And then we took it down with machines, which also offered interesting glimpses straight into the guts of a house. And this is the ending of the demolition. And the demolition was really interesting because as masonry restoration contractors, we get a lot of calls from homeowners, and a lot of the work that we do is undoing Portland cement repairs, which if you've owned a historic house, you've probably heard about the dangers of Portland cement. And what we found was a large reason why this house fell down was that there was Portland cement repointing pretty much around the whole building. And what that did, and you can kind of see it here, you have to look closely. This little crust right here is Portland cement that someone used for repointing when the joints were open. And behind it is the original lime mortar. But what the Portland cement has done is it's trapped moisture in the joint. It's introduced salts, and it's completely eroded the lime mortar. So all you're left with is sand. So if you think about the vast majority of the bedding mortar in this house wasn't really mortar, it was just sand. It's not hard to see how structural issues would come up. And then on top of that, like I mentioned earlier, this whole house was re-bricked when the 1827 edition was built. And the Flemish bond that normally is strong and holds a house together wasn't able to be truly Flemish bond because they were adding one weight of brick. So that long brick couldn't actually go into the brick behind. So the masons cut off those bricks. So from the outside, it looks wonderful. It's one of the best brick houses in Virginia, I'm sure at the time. But structurally, it was just a ticking time bomb. And then with the addition of the Portland cement, that just accelerated all of the deterioration and led to the failure that we saw. So sad, but it's definitely a worthy cautionary tale, and also counter to the "they don't build them like they used to" thing. They don't, but not. It's not always that pure of a statement. So I'm going to let Casey go over the future plans. And I think that's all we have after that.
All right. So I think the biggest answer to what the future plans are for Berry Hill is that we don't know yet. Even as far as the research goes, what Sam and I have been kind of touching on throughout the presentation, this entire project just led us into even more questions and more research about not only just the people, but about the architectural evolution of the house itself. And so there's still, as far as research is concerned, there's still so much more to be uncovered. And in particular, I mean, as far as research subjects go, I mean, obviously, all of this wasn't happening without the assistance of enslaved labor. And we were even able to uncover some specific deed records as well as some other slave schedules and things like that that indicated who might have been enslaved by Reynolds Chapman and who might have assisted in the construction of this project. So research-wise, a lot of people to still uncover, a lot of architectural evolution and history to still uncover. But as far as where we go from here with what is currently here physically, the main goal is to make sure that we preserve the 1827 block that's still standing. And so Sam and his team with Dominion Traditional will be coming back out in the spring. They will be taking any areas specifically on the elevation of the main block where the demolition occurred, where now there's a little bit of exposure. Some of the mortar joints need to be repointed. It really just needs to be made weather tight at this point to ensure no further moisture damage, no elements, nothing is getting in there to further exacerbate any of the deterioration that might already be occurring to the 1827 block. Additionally, at some point, we'll also have to have a carpenter come out and do a little bit of work, much like they will do with the masonry issues. There are several examples of that are occurring currently on this 1827 block where there's just some deterioration of those exterior wooden elements. So we just want to make sure that everything is weather tight and cleaned up and ready to go so that this can be maintained appropriately. And then at that point, that is still an ongoing conversation that we'll have to have about what the use for the property is going to be. We currently don't have one. A lot of ideas have been tossed around: an event center, a wedding venue, bed and breakfast, a combination of the two, or even managing to keep it as a private residential property and a working farm. So there are lots of options that are available, but those are things that we'll be crossing that bridge when we get there. We just don't have the answers to that yet. Our primary goal, my primary goal in particular, is to just make sure that we are maintaining what is still there. And now that Sam and his team have appropriately salvaged everything that was there from the wing and from the kitchen addition, we know that we'll have that physical imprint and information for a future reconstruction, should that be the route that the owner chooses to go or a future owner chooses to go with this property. So I would say, certainly stay tuned. I'm sure that maybe Ray will have us back in the future at some point to kind of have a Berry Hill Part 2 once some more things have started to happen with the property. Otherwise, I wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming out. Sam?
Got a question for you, Sam. Did your research find out any information about the old Masonic cemetery that's located behind the house on that property?
So I'll point out a little bit about that. So I have started to delve into a little bit of research about burials on Berry Hill's property. From what I've been able to find through deed research that mentions cemeteries on the property, I will interject with saying that I haven't been able to find out much more about the Masonic cemetery in particular, but I know that that is also there adjacent to that Berry Hill parcel line. But I do know that there was a Chapman family cemetery on the property, and there was also a slave cemetery on the property. So we believe at this point that we kind of have an idea of where both of those specific Berry Hill cemeteries are located. Based on mapping and the information I've been able to find, I think that the slave cemetery is now located in an area where it is now actually covered in vineyard. There is a section of Berry Hill's property in that particular area where it's Horton Vineyards, has some vines planted on the property. So we believe that that is about the location of what would have been the slave cemetery. And then in another location, which there might be something between the Masonic cemetery and the Chapman family cemetery. So that's another one of those good research questions that we'll have to delve into. So there might be a connection between those two, but there was a separate Chapman family cemetery, of which there are no, to my knowledge, no markers remaining, no iron railing remaining. So there's really no indication of where that was physically remaining on the property.
Yes.
Two questions. I don't think, maybe one photograph of the interior of the remaining block, what's that condition? And actually, how many acres are left on the property, or for Berry Hill?
Right, so for Berry Hills property, it has diminished quite a bit. It is now about 26 acres. So that's about what remains as far as that goes. And I'm sorry, what was your question about the main block?
The interior condition, I mean, we saw what happened with what you think is the original house.
Right.
But if you're going to preserve that other block, what's the condition of the interior?
Yeah, absolutely. So the interior of the main block is in pretty good shape, actually. The late owner actually had started to perform some work on that specific section of the house. And there was evidence where it had kind of started in the wing as well, but the majority of that more modern renovation work was started in that 1827 block. So because of that, it's in actually pretty pristine condition. It's just kind of some of those exterior elements that are starting to need a little bit of maintenance. Oh, there's a lot of hands. I saw your hand first.
The 1827 block also had the same problem with the Portland cement as the other sections did.
To a lesser extent. And what we see with houses is it's usually not one thing that causes massive failure like this. It's a lot of things. So it's less of a concern for us at that, and for the Portland cement on that wing.
I guess, who it's owned by the Helen retailer or local trust now, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And then who controls that?
Her financial advisor, I believe, is who controls the trust, at least for as far as several of her historic properties are concerned, including Berry Hill.
And so you don't know whether it's going to be sold or what's going to happen?
No, and that's who I've been working with. I was able to work at least a little bit with Mrs. Taylor before she passed away. But after that, once everything was kind of set up in a trust and her financial advisor took over certain aspects of that, I really worked mostly one-on-one with him, which I continue to do now, but there are still lots of other projects that are ongoing at the time. So we're kind of moving as quickly as possible, but also as far as Berry Hill is concerned, working with the seasons and the elements as well. So.
Are you referring to Brandon Taylor?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
in no relation. Just so everyone knows that, yes.
Where's all the trim, everything stored, everything you salvaged from?
We stored it on site. And the owner had a place for us to store it. Yeah, so we tried to keep it all close as much as possible.
So is there any particular use now that those elements, those salvaged elements will be used for? Or is it kind of in limbo until you get a fuller idea of what the ultimate restoration is going to look like and usage of the property after that?
Yep, that's right. It's kind of in its own limbo at this point. I wish I had more answers to what the use was going to be. I mean, as a preservationist and as attached as I've become to this house and this property over the past couple of years, ultimately I would love to see someone come along who wanted to take everything that was salvaged and do as in kind of a reconstruction as possible to essentially make it look much like it did before it was demolished. But that remains to be seen if that'll happen or not. So maybe a future. Yes.
Question on the cemeteries. So it sounds like from what you said, the slave cemetery, we previously thought the aerial photos and topographical maps from the 70s made it look like Chapman Cemetery was out in the vineyard, but your research is showing that maybe that was enslaved community cemetery.
And that's speculative. A lot of that is, some of that research is founded in some things that I found in some deed research, but some of that is also just more anecdotal and conversations that I've had with locals who, there were a few people who grew up basically going to Berry Hill when it was the dairy farm, and their families worked the dairy farm with the Hill family. And they were recalling multiple outbuildings that were still standing at the time in the 20th century. And they also were pointing out where the Chapman family cemetery was located. And it was in a completely separate location from where we originally thought that was. So some of it is founded in actual research and a lot of it is anecdotal at this point, but still to be determined on that one.
Just out of curiosity, is there any remaining drawings or photographs of, there used to be spectacular gardens behind the house. I mean, just incredible gardens.
I have heard stories, including those same anecdotal stories of people who are reminiscing on what those gardens used to look like. In particular, when Mrs. Hill was the caretaker there and taking care of those gardens, and some of her plantings, a lot of which still come up to this day, depending on the season. So it's still a very lovely garden. But in my research, I don't know about yours, Sam, but I have not been able to find really any photos. It's been difficult to find any historic photos of that property.
Which we were surprised about.
Yeah, we think there would be because they were very detailed.
Very detailed, but even of the whole property being on top of a hill in Orange, Civil War was here. So there's photos of less involved places in the Civil War, and there's not many photos here at all. So the oldest photo we have is 1930s, I think, when the WPA did a survey of the house. But we don't have any other photos, and it almost makes me think that they're sitting in some archive somewhere, not actually, or not being shared, or no one's actually looked at it and said, this is Orange, this is Berry Hill.
Right.
Because it seems hard for me to imagine that there's not photos somewhere of this.
Has any additional research been done on structures built by William Phillips in this area?
So UVA's done a lot as they've started to learn about their architectural history. There's quite a bit of research on William B. Phillips, and there's actually some pretty good resources online. And a lot of those builders kind of built in Central Virginia, and then they actually went over the valley and built Western State Hospital in Stanton and the Virginia School of the Deaf and Blind in the 1840s. So there's actually quite a bit of research on William B. Phillips.
And we even have found a letter, I believe that's the letter written by Reynolds Chapman to, was it the mayor of Madison?
I think so,
I think
recommending him.
Right, and he is recommending, this was right after Berry Hill and that main block had been built, and Reynolds Chapman is recommending Phillips' work to the mayor of Madison for their courthouse.
The Builders Board, you alluded to, it seemed like there was a little bit of a question in the way you brought that up. You've concluded for now your hypothesis is that it's a Builders Board. Do you have other possible hypotheses you're considering as to what its origin might be?
All great questions. I mean, we call it the Builders Board. That was kind of what we were originally thinking. I know that Sam and his team were able to kind of also have a good look at it. Ray and myself and the folks here at the Historical Society, we've had it under all sorts of lighting, trying to decipher. They wrote in pencil, and some of it is just, some of the letters are just not super legible. And so, I mean, we know it says Orange County, Virginia. We know it has two names on it. We know it has a July, I believe it's July 27th, I think it is, 1806 date on it. And it's got a few other scribblings, but one of the names seems to be female. So we're unsure who might have done it. It could have been visitors. It could have been those enslaved. We're unsure of who it could have been.
But the 1806 date makes sense for construction. So it's kind of an educated guess we made. Still speculation, but there's some backing to it. Yes, sir.
Any idea about who was the builder in 1806?
No idea. Absolutely no idea.
You made an indication of like how it was built to begin with, almost seemed like a temporary, or maybe temporary wasn't the word.
Right.
Built to fail, I guess.
Well, I think what we found, well, so in 1806, a lot of the research has shown if you're building a brick house in Virginia, because of its labor-intensive nature and material-intensive nature, you were a person of means, and you were building something that was permanent. And at least in the Valley, a lot of those folks that were building those were people that had the generational wealth that were 2 or 3 generations removed from all the people who had settled. So it was, if you see a brick building, it's typically would not be built, even somewhat temporarily. And I think a lot of the structural issues happened mainly from the adding of the brick facade in 1827. But even still, the walls were only 3 bricks thick. So unless they took off that outer layer in 1827 and added the new layer on, it was a 2 brick wide thick wall, which is not not substantial enough to really take the load of all the architectural elements. So we really don't know, but it's pretty safe to say that if they were building a house out of brick in 1806, it was a pretty substantial house. Yeah, pretty much. As is usually the case. You know.
Has there been any indication on how much time you guys have to, I mean, you said eventually it could be sold, it could be turned into event space, it's going to go to somebody. The foundation has every intention eventually of disposing of it. I mean, have they given you a time frame on, because they could put it up themselves at any time, as is.
Right. Yeah. There's no time frame, which, you know, as far as I'm concerned, as the preservationist working on it, that bodes well for me. I think I appreciate the fact that they've been more than willing to understand the process going into this and just how much of a haul this house was actually going to be and what an undertaking it was actually going to be. So I've of course been super appreciative of that, and there's really no timeline at all. We're just trying to make sure that what's there is preserved, so that way we can make sure that that's there, and that's one less thing to worry about when eventually we do get to it. It's not necessarily so that the Helen Marie Taylor Irrevocable Trust would dispose of the property. It could very well just remain in their possession. But either way, we would certainly want to make sure that whatever ends up happening to it, it's going to be a good fit. And whether it's the trust that continues to own it and be a good steward of the property, that if someone wants to come along as a new buyer, a new owner, then they would also be continuing to be good stewards of this property.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.